In September 1953, at Suncheon Air Base in North Korea, a routine morning smelled of kerosene and damp earth. Senior Lieutenant No Kum-sok was checking the instruments of his MiG-15, but this time, he wasn't just preparing for a training flight. In his flight suit pocket, a small leaflet burned against his skin, the American Operation Moolah. Printed on that paper was a number that seemed like pure fantasy, $100,000. For a young pilot whose annual income in North Korea didn't even reach $1,000, this was a ticket to a completely different reality. The Americans weren't just offering money, they were offering to buy freedom, asylum, and a new life in exchange for the most guarded secret of the socialist bloc. No Kum-sok understood. Behind him were 3 years of grueling study and 40 combat missions against Western sabers. He was the elite, one of the best, but today he had decided on what the system called absolute betrayal. While mechanics bustled around the machine and the squadron commander gave final instructions, no one suspected that this MiG, worth a fortune, would vanish from radar in just 20 minutes. Was it cold calculation for the sake of enrichment, or a desperate leap from a cage where listening to a neighbor's radio could get you sent to a firing squad? Every toggle switch in the cockpit now felt like a trigger, and the roar of the D-45 engine was a countdown to a moment that would forever change the balance of power in the skies over the Korean peninsula. The atmosphere at Suncheon Base that morning was saturated with the paranoia that had become the habitual backdrop of No Kum-sok's life. The war had officially ended just 2 months ago, but the sky over Korea remained transparent and cold, like the calm before a new storm. No knew every detail in the cockpit of his fighter by heart. 3 years in the academy and 40 combat missions had turned him into a part of this machine. The mechanics checking the aircraft's components acted in coordination, unaware that their best pilot had already mentally crossed the border. To them, it was a routine training flight, but for No, it was the finale of a long internal struggle. Just a day ago, he had learned of the execution of a neighbor for listening to South Korean radio. The system did not forgive even the slightest interest in the outside world. The senior lieutenant closed the cockpit canopy, feeling the cold of the metal under his fingers. At that moment, the base seemed to him not like a home, but like a set for a play that was about to end. The dispatcher gave clearance for takeoff, and the mechanic habitually raised a thumb. No pushed the throttle. The D-45 engine delivered full thrust, and the concrete runway began to rapidly recede under the landing gear. He was taking off in a paradise from which he intended to escape forever. The landing gear retracted with a characteristic dull thud, and the ground began to rapidly turn into a toy model. At the control tower, no one showed any concern. For everyone, it was a routine training flight along a standard route. However, having reached the required altitude, No Kum-sok performed a maneuver that instantly turned him into a man on a suicide mission. He sharply turned his fighter to the south. The compass needle froze at 180 degrees, a direct course for the demilitarized zone. At that moment, the pilot's heart was literally thumping in his ears, and his hands trembled on the control stick. He knew that every second was now working against him. The MiG-15 could hit 670 miles per hour, 1,076 kilometers per hour, but there were still 50 miles, 80 kilometers, to the safety of the border. These were the longest 5 minutes of his life, the razor-thin line between political asylum and a firing squad. No Kum-sok kept remembering the Operation Moolah flyer. The Americans weren't just promising money, they were offering a chance to escape a system where yesterday's hero could become an enemy of the people simply due to a suspicion of disloyalty. He had chosen freedom, and now there was no turning back, only forward, on full engine thrust. Suddenly, the radio in No Kum-sok's headset crackled to life. Static was replaced by the sharp voice of a controller. His absence from the assigned grid had been noticed suspiciously fast. Bort 201, respond. Why have you left your course? Turn back immediately! The command sounded like a gunshot. No felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that the system, trained to catch the slightest deviations, had already cast its net. Instead of answering, he simply switched off the radio. A ringing silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the monotonous hum of the turbine. No knew that red lights were now flashing at every command post across the north. Was it a fatal coincidence, or had one of his comrades already informed on him? In a world of total surveillance, suspicion always moved faster than action. To vanish, No made a desperate move. He shoved the fighter into a dive. The altimeter spun wildly. 1,000 meters, 800, 600. At such a low altitude, the radars of that era often went blind due to reflections from hills and trees. The MiG-15 screamed across the landscape at nearly 600 miles per hour, 1,000 kilometers per hour, hugging the terrain. He was now alone against everyone, a ghost in a steel shell, and his only ally was physics. The MiG-15 was flying so low that the pine tops looked like a blurred sea of green. At speeds exceeding 550 miles per hour, 900 kilometers per hour, any mistake, the slightest twitch of the control stick, meant instant death. No Kum-sok could feel the aircraft shuddering against the dense layers of air. Physics was taking hold, turning the flight into a struggle against the atmosphere itself. He knew that the American radars to the south might not see him either. But right now, he was more worried about his own side. From an altitude of a few hundred feet, he was a perfect target for anti-aircraft crews who wouldn't care who exactly was screaming over their heads. To them, any aircraft heading south in radio silence was target number one. Suddenly, he caught a flash in his peripheral vision. In the rearview mirror, framed against the bright morning sun, a dark speck appeared. It grew rapidly, taking on the distinct shape of a swept wing. It wasn't an American Sabre, it was another MiG-15. No Kum-sok realized the hunt was on, and his pursuer wasn't just a random patrol, but someone who knew his tactics down to the last maneuver. The speck in the rearview mirror grew at a terrifying speed. No Kum-sok recognized that piloting style, aggressive, confident, almost arrogant. It was Junior Lieutenant Park. They had studied at the academy together, shared meager rations, and flown as wingmen during the hottest days of the war. Park had been his best friend. Now, he was his executioner. No's radio was switched off, but he could practically feel his pursuer's rage through his skin. Park wasn't just following orders, he felt personally betrayed. Between the two MiGs screaming just above the deck, an invisible duel of wills emerged. Park began to bank into his six, closing the distance to a critical 1,000 feet, 300 meters. This was the perfect kill zone for a burst from the NS-23 cannons. No Kum-sok saw his pursuer rock his wings, a final ultimatum. Slow down and turn back, or I will shoot you down. No understood the stakes. If he obeyed, a tribunal and a bullet to the back of the head awaited him within an hour of landing. If he didn't, he might die right here in a burning cockpit, shot down by his own friend. He chose a third option, a high-stakes gamble that no pilot following Soviet instructions would ever dare. The Soviet flight school of that era was built on rigid discipline. Any deviation meant a court-martial. Pilots were trained to fly like robots, strictly by the book. No Kum-sok knew that Park would act exactly as he had been taught. It was this predictability that No decided to weaponize to stay alive. As the distance between the jets hit the breaking point, No did the unthinkable. Instead of attempting a standard defensive turn, he yanked the control stick back with everything he had. The MiG-15, possessing immense thrust-to-weight ratio, literally stood on its tail and shot vertically into the sky. It was an extreme maneuver. A 5G load instantly slammed the pilot into his seat, gray spots danced before his eyes, and the skin on his face pulled back into a tight mask. Park, flying at maximum speed, simply couldn't react in time. His jet shot right under the belly of No's aircraft, losing visual contact for just a split second. But a second was all No needed. At the apex of his climb, No Kum-sok flipped the fighter over and dove back down at a different angle, gaining precious yards of separation. He had broken the ultimate dogma. He had started to improvise. In that moment, he ceased to be a cog in the machine and became a free hunter, his life hanging on the tip of a wing. No's maneuver momentarily dazed Park, but the veteran pursuer recovered quickly. Park threw his jet into a steep bank and caught the fugitive in his sights once more. The gap closed again. At that moment, the sky over the Imjin River, the natural border between north and south, exploded with red flashes. Park squeezed the trigger. The MiG-15's 3 cannons, 2 23mm and 1 massive 37mm, roared simultaneously. Fiery tracers carved through the air just inches from No's cockpit canopy. The air filled with the stench of cordite and the thunder of shells detonating somewhere behind him. No felt every thud against his aircraft's skin as if the blows were landing on his own body. One of the shells clipped the tail fin. A metallic screech drowned out the roar of the engine and the control stick jerked violently to the side. Control surface failure. The thought flashed through No's mind. The aircraft began to fishtail, making it nearly impossible to keep on course. Below, the steel-gray expanse of the river shimmered. The finish line. Park was banking for a second pass, determined at all costs to prevent the traitor from crossing that invisible boundary. No Kum-sok realized, if he didn't reach the other bank now, his plane would become a flaming torch over his homeland within a minute. The second No Kum-sok's damaged MiG crossed that invisible line over the water, the political map of the world fractured. This was no longer a training flight or an internal pursuit. It was a full-scale incursion into UN-controlled airspace. 2 jet fighters with red stars on their wings were screaming into South Korea at transonic speeds. At the American radar stations in Kimpo, operators froze in disbelief. 2 clear targets blipped on their screens, coming fast from the north. Is this an attack? The start of a new war? The question pulsed through headquarters. The alert system wailed across the entire airfield, declaring a maximum state of emergency. Anti-aircraft crews on both sides of the border brought their guns to bear, awaiting the command to fire. No Kum-sok could see the silhouette of the American airbase ahead. His aircraft vibrated from the damage, and Park was still pressing the attack from behind. It was a stalemate. To the south, he was an aggressor. To the north, a traitor. No was in a dead zone between 2 worlds, where any missile launched from the ground or air would be a logical end to his journey. He knew he had only one chance to survive, to make the Americans believe he came in peace faster than they could pull the trigger. At Kimpo Airfield, pure chaos was erupting. The sirens wailed incessantly, and F-86 Sabres were already racing down the taxiways, ready to scramble and destroy the intruders. American pilots saw 2 MiGs in their sights. To them, this wasn't a surrender. It was a treacherous attack in violation of the armistice. No Kum-sok knew he had seconds left. He made the gesture that in aviation signifies total capitulation. He dropped his landing gear long before the runway and began to rock his wings from side to side. It was a cry for help in the language of metal and aerodynamics. At that moment, the situation became lethally dangerous. Park, flying behind, saw his friend's gear drop and realized this was the end. He could no longer excuse No's flight as an accidental deviation. This was an open defection to the enemy. American fighters were already moving in for the kill, catching the 2 Soviet-built jets in a pincer maneuver. No Kum-sok was trapped. Behind him, an infuriated friend with cannons ready. In front, Americans prepared to put a missile into anyone carrying a red star on their wings. Then, something happened that no one expected. Park, whose finger was already on the trigger, suddenly broke off the attack. His aircraft pulled a sharp, almost violent bank and began heading back north. Why didn't he fire? Was it a mechanical failure, an empty ammo drum, or did an old friendship stronger than an oath of allegiance speak up at the very last moment? For Park, that turn proved fatal. He returned to base as a hero who had pursued the traitor, but the system knows no mercy for those who let their target slip away. It was later revealed that the junior lieutenant was executed just a week later. He was charged with cowardice and failure to follow orders. The friend who remained loyal to the regime paid with his life simply for allowing another man to become free. No Kum-sok watched as the speck in his rearview mirror faded into the haze. He was alone in an alien sky. Ahead lay the concrete runway of Kimpo, lined with American fighters. 2 Sabres were heading directly at him in a head-on approach. Now his fate depended not on his marksmanship, but on how quickly he could prove he was not an enemy. The landing was beyond reckless. The damaged rudder prevented No Kum-sok from leveling the plane, and the MiG-15 approached the runway with a dangerous list. The American Sabre pilots froze in midair, watching as the enemy machine practically fell onto their airfield. At the last moment, No managed to grease the fighter onto the concrete. Tires shrieked, the plane bounced, but it held. The MiG skidded to a halt at the very end of the runway, kicking up a cloud of dust. Before the engine could even flame out, the fighter was surrounded by a ring of jeeps and armed guards. Dozens of barrels were leveled at the pilot's face. No Kum-sok slowly raised his hands, feeling the wild tension of the last few minutes give way to a deathly exhaustion. As the canopy slid back, an American officer shouted, "Who are you?" No Kum-sok, whose English was poor, shouted the one word he had memorized from the leaflet, "Asylum." That word became his password into a new world. But as he climbed down the ladder, he didn't yet realize that his plane was currently more important than his life. For U.S. intelligence, this battered piece of metal with red stars was more valuable than an entire air regiment. As soon as No Kum-sok was taken away for interrogation, Kimpo Airfield transformed into the most guarded scientific laboratory on the planet. The MiG-15 wasn't just towed into a hangar, it was surrounded by the finest minds of the Pentagon. To American engineers, this aircraft was a black box, a riddle that had cost the lives of hundreds of UN pilots. The very first inspection left technicians bewildered. Opening the engine cowlings, they discovered a British heart. The Klimov K1 engine turned out to be an almost perfect copy of the British Rolls-Royce Nene. The USSR had managed to achieve an incredible technological leap simply by copying Western technology and adapting it to their needs. But the engine wasn't the only shock. The Americans were stunned by the contrast. Crude, almost butchered seams on the skin and uneven riveting sat alongside brilliantly simple and reliable engineering solutions. The MiG-15 wasn't built for pilot comfort. It was built for one purpose: destruction. The lack of hydraulic boosters made handling at high speeds grueling labor, but it was this very austerity that made the machine incredibly resilient. The autopsy of the beast showed that the West was facing an adversary that prioritized mass production and brute force over technological elegance. However, the Americans' greatest discovery wasn't the engine or the metal skin. Inside the MiG's cockpit, they found a leather folder containing flight instructions. When the translators finished their work, a wave of astonishment swept through the U.S. Air Force headquarters. These documents revealed the fundamental weakness of the entire Soviet aviation system, a total distrust of the individual. The instructions strictly forbade pilots from any form of improvisation. Every maneuver, every turn had to be coordinated with the ground control station. A Soviet pilot was not a free hunter, but a biological robot whose actions were rigidly scripted. The combat system was built on a series of algorithms: see, report, wait for orders. The Americans immediately changed their saber tactics. They realized that if they forced the MiG pilots into non-standard, chaotic dogfights, their entire command and control system would collapse. Stripped of their initiative, the Soviet pilots became lost in dynamic engagements. It was this very analysis of No Kum-sok's secret folder that shifted the aerial kill ratio in Korea from an even 1-to-1 to a staggering 10-to-1 in favor of the U.S. The Americans hadn't just bought a plane, they had purchased the access code to the tactical mindset of an entire empire. No Kum-sok received his $100,000, over $1.1 million in today's currency, changed his name to Kenneth Rowe, and became a successful engineer in the United States. He worked for Pan Am and Boeing, designing aircraft that now fly all over the world. But behind the glossy cover of the American dream lay a price that cannot be measured in currency. While Kenneth was building his career in Dayton, the machine of retribution was grinding away in his homeland. His mother miraculously escaped, but dozens of people who knew him, from mechanics to distant relatives, vanished into labor camps. His act saved the lives of thousands of American pilots by giving the U.S. the keys to air superiority, but it also forever scorched everything that connected him to his past. Today, that very same MiG-15 with the tail number 201 stands in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. It looks like a cold, lifeless exhibit, but for those who know the history, this aircraft is a monument to the greatest bluff of the Cold War. No Kum-sok's story is not just a tale of desertion. It is a drama about a man who decided his life was worth more than the ideology of a regime, and about a system that proved powerless against one pilot's simple desire to be free.